Last night, I watched a movie. Not surprising. I couldn't stand watching the Laker game any longer. Couldn't believe Russell Westbrook, 1 for 14. Yikes. But I turned the channel. I'd already watched Oregon beat up on Washington. And so I turned it over to my standby, Sven Gulli. And I enjoyed the movie. I've seen it 1.5 million times, called Munster Go Home. And Herman Munster inherits a castle in England. And they do one of those TV movies, and it was cheesy and campy, and I didn't have to think at all. But what it did remind me is that whenever we watch a movie, whenever we watch a play, whatever we do, we sit back and we notice the cast of characters. Georgianne, when I used to go watch her plays, you'd go in and be given a playbill. And in the playbill, it would tell all the various actors and give a little bit about their background, who they would be playing and different things of that nature. And so I got to kind of enjoy that. And I've gotten to enjoy looking at all the various actors, who plays what and so on. And I do that because Linda is invariably asking me a question for one of her crossword puzzles. Who was and what part did? And so I'll say, well, whatever it is. And she'll look at me and she'll go, how do you know that? I don't know, other than I do learn something watching Sven Gulli, I guess. But in the 15th chapter of the book of Luke, there's a series of verses there, wherein Jesus lays out for us a parable that plays out kind of like a play. You have 3 distinct characters that are involved. You have the Father, who represents, in an anthropomorphic sense, God the Father. You have the younger son, who represents all those who have departed, gone the way that John talks about in 1 John, the first chapter, verses 15 through 17, who the lure of the world has pulled on them. The third part is that of the elder son, and he is representative of the self-righteous, the pious, the puffed up, that Paul talks about back in the book of Romans, in the 3rd chapter in verses 9 and 10, and of course elsewhere in the New Testament. But all of these 3 play a very vital role in this parable. And every time I look at this parable, I'm reminded of how each one of us has certain aspects. Oh, I'm not saying we're deity. It's not what I'm saying. But I do realize that Peter talks about how we can become partakers of the divine nature. By that, he's simply referring to that we can know what it's like to take on the characteristics of righteousness. We're never going to be deity, although the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other New Age concept religions try to teach us that we are God in embryonic form. We're not. But yet what is found here is, as we look at this, it's going to take us this morning and then get into this afternoon to look at this sermon. But I think that we can relate to each part that is laid out for us. I can easily relate to the young man and, to a degree, to the older son. Looking at it from a standpoint of a father, I can see where that applies as well. So the relationships are there. And so I think as we look at this, all of us can carry away something of a unique nature. Now, before we even get started, it should be noted that both sons had a unique relationship with the father, each one approaching him in a different way. And I kind of like the depiction of the older son. Not that I identify more with him than the younger son, but I just look at the whole dynamic of a family, and especially under the Jewish culture, that the older son felt a sense of responsibility. how he would stay with the family, stay in proximity to it, that he could be a help and a source of encouragement and all that is involved therein. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that the scriptures do teach that we do have a responsibility to our parents as they age. Not all recognize that, but we do have that responsibility. But let's begin to look at it a little bit closer. Go in to Luke 15 and look at verse 11. Because in verse 11, we begin the investigation. And for some reason, and I don't know why, the slides did not transfer over as planned. It should have 15, 11 through 21, so on. So for whatever reason, we had a little bit of a problem with that. But not my fault. But I will take full responsibility. And I trust you'll bear with us. Anyways, Luke 15, verse 11. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me. Do you like that? Give me. I've got it coming. Give it to me. Oh, you got it coming. But I don't think that's what he was referring to, because what we see later on comes out. Give me. Going on, the share of the estate that falls to me. And he divided his wealth between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country. He began to be in need. And he went and attached himself to one of the citizens of that country. And he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he was longing to fill his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating. No one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread? But I am dying here with hunger. I will get up. I will go to my father. Will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. Well, let's stop there. Let's begin to look at it. The father divided whatever he had. And he gave it to the 2 sons. But see, the younger son had already departed in his mind. By the mere fact he goes and says, give me. I feel I have this entitled to me. And so I want it. Usually, the wealth is dispersed after the death of the parent. The young man pushes the point. A sense of entitlement. Do we see that today? That people feel a sense of entitlement, not just young people, but people across the board. Well, they owe me. The choices I have made, the decisions I've made have brought me to this situation, and now they owe me. No. That type of thinking is truly repugnant. We're not owed anything. We're not. And this young man thought he was. You owe me. I can imagine what I would have had happen to me had I went to my father and said, hey, old man, you owe me. My dad was short, about yay tall. He was extremely strong. But he wouldn't have put up with that for a second. In fact, when I was 16, he basically told me, goodbye. I got you a job down at UD's gas station. Goodbye. It's basically what I was told. Your mom and I have bought a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house. 1 bedroom is for us. The other is for your sister. Goodbye. Oh, we'll put a little tin trailer or tin building out for your stuff. Goodbye. Did I deserve it? Probably. Because of the way I was behaving. But I never thought that I was entitled to anything. I really didn't. And for this young man to think that he's got a sense of entitlement, it's just really striking. The other thing I find interesting, looking at it from a psychological standpoint, go back and look, and it says, a couple days later, he gathered together everything. Everything was gathered together. Now, I know when I left home, went down to UD's gas station, began working still in high school, and then also started editing the page of the local newspaper youth page, that I left stuff at home. I left boxes of stuff. And I would find the need to go back and get stuff. I knew I was never going to move back home. I knew that. But subconsciously, wasn't I wanting to go back home? This young man took everything. I don't want to go there again. I don't want to ever go to that place again. Never. That's what it's meant by he took everything that he had. Wanted to make a break. Wanted to make a clean break. Jesus, back in the book of Matthew, in the 6th chapter, and verse 24, talks about we have to figure out who we're going to serve, either God or mammon. We have to figure out where we're going to put our affections. We're either going to serve the Father or not. This young man said, Dad, I'm done with you. And that's looking at it from the standpoint of a father and son. I never, ever want to bring down God to that level of referring him to anything other than Father. It's demeaning. He is our Heavenly Father. But this young man looked at his father and said, I'm done with you. I'm taking everything I own and what you gave me, and I'm gone. The break was total. The break was absolute. And you see all of that. And so he departed long before he ever had his feet touch the pathway leading away from his father's home. Now, you keep looking. And what you see is that he took that which his father had given him, that which his father had worked hard to accumulate. He had saved, he had squandered, he had laid everything down for his family. His son grabs hold of it and takes that and everything that his father provided to him over the years, all his possessions, and left. And then lost it all. Over the years, our sons have taken everything they had and left. And they've lost it all. Lost it. I mean, one of them had stuff stuck in a storage locker and didn't pay the bill. That was sold at auction. And in a box, he had baseball cards. Thousands of them. Worth, undoubtedly, even if it was only 10 cents a card, and I know they were worth more than that. He had several $100s, more like several thousand, lost. It's amazing. But this young man did that. Squandered everything. Now, what does that show? It shows an ingrate, demanding, self-motivated, frivolous. All of the things you can see on that transparency, and then some. And he wanted to get far away from his father's eye. That's indicative, and went to a distant land. And he embraced all that his heart desired. He was quite the antithesis of what Moses was. If you go back into the book of Hebrews in the 11th chapter, verse 25, Moses, by faith, chose to reject the passing pleasures of sin. He embraced a way that would align him with the God of heaven. This young man said, no, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Look what it got him. He ended up feeding swine. Have you ever smelt a pig farm? Oh, they're nasty. When we lived in Las Vegas, and I would go play golf at Craig Ranch, which is the north side of Las Vegas. And if the wind was just right, you would get the stench of a pig farm. And on days that happened, nobody would play Craig Ranch. Nobody would. And if you were of the mind to play, you could go in and you could beg them. And it wouldn't take much begging. And they would give you a discounted rate until such a time that the wind would change. It was that bad. And so on the days that the wind was that way, because I was cheap, I would go play Craig Ranch. I would buy my fee on. You'd get a cart for next to nothing because the stench was that bad. And then I would pray all day long that the wind would change so I wouldn't be so intolerable. Could you imagine working in that stench day after day after knowing what you had living with your father? How your father had provided for you. And now where you were, that's where this man gets to. And then he was saying, I'm so hungry. I'd be willing to eat the pods that I'm feeding the pigs. And I think back to what my father had to offer. See, that's what a lot of people don't realize. As they go down that slippery slope into the realm of sin, they don't realize the spiral that keeps them deeper and deeper and deeper. And they need something to stop that, something to hold them back. Well, this man, it's kind of interesting because this man had to be broken. But even though he was broken, you'll notice that he had to be broken again. Solomon, back in the book of Ecclesiastes, talks about the depiction of an individual who becomes a drunk. And it's so sad when you look at it. Well, let's go over to Proverbs 23. And in Proverbs 23, and you can hold your finger back here at Luke 15, but in Proverbs 23, go down to about verse 29. And notice the writings of Solomon. Who has woe, Solomon writes? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complainings? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long over wine. Those who go to taste mixed wine. Do not look on wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. He then goes on to say, at last it bites like a serpent. It stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things. Now stop there a minute. The argumentation with regards to mixed wine is kind of interesting. But when I read through this and I recognize what that area is like and realize that for the longest time, the use of opium and the use of hashish and other things, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities. What he's talking about here is drinking wine that is laced. Probably not electric wine. Electric wine is a phrase that was used in the 60s, talking about wine that had been inundated with LSD. Drop so many tabs of LSD in, shake the bottle of Spagnata up, and party time. And your eyes will see things. He's talking about something along that line. And he's talking about the level of going to that depth. The state of Oregon has legalized pretty much everything. Maybe not legalized, but they do not prosecute any longer drug possession and drug usage. I have a lot of friends that live in Oregon, and they're talking about the rise of individuals that are just not able to function because of the degree of debauchery that they've gone to. And so here Solomon talks about it. In Luke 15, Jesus is referring to it, I think, in the parable here of the young man. But even if he's not talking about the incorporation of drugs in with the wine, he's still talking about the dependency on wine and things of that nature. And saying, look how it pulls you down. And you look at it and you got a classic description. He goes on a little bit further. And you will be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea. I know there are several of us who have been there, done that. And believe me, it's not a fun feeling. And such, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6, such were some of you. One who lies down on top of the mast. They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me, but I did not know it. When shall I awake? And then he goes on to say, basically, the answer is, when I awake, I will seek another drink. This young man had gone to that level. And then the beautiful part about it is he comes to his senses. Now, in Jeremiah, the 17th chapter, and verses 5 and 6, there is the contrast between prosperity with God and poverty apart from God. And that's truly what we see spiritually for us. That with God, we have prosperity. We have someone that cares for us. Dan was talking about the words of the song we sang, about he is our friend. As a father, to the degree possible, I try to be a friend to my children, as did Linda. We tried to guide them, to instruct them. Ultimately, it had to be their choice. The father in this parable did the same thing. He was there as a constant. But ultimately, the decision came back to the son. What are you going to do with what I've taught you? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? Ultimately, the son does come to his senses. He sensed that he was in need of security. That all those so-called friends of his alienated themselves from him. The minute he no longer had what they wanted, they were gone. Like that bad smell from the pig farm on a windy day. That wind picked up and gone. Gone. Amazing how my golf score changed too. But the friends that he thought he had disappeared him that quickly. Like a bad smell on a windy day. And so he recognized he was alone. He was destitute. He was broke. What am I going to do? One of the saddest songs to me is the song Homeward Bound. And I remember it from when I used to stand on freeway on-ramps with my thumb stuck out, trying to get a ride, trying to go home. But the weird part about it, I had no home, or felt like I didn't have a home. This young man came to his senses and says, I know what I'm going to do. I know what I've got to do. And I've got to do it with a sense of humility. So let's go back into Luke 15 and begin to see how the scene now changes. He awakes in his despair, total despair. He comes to his senses. He now says, I know what I have to do. I know it. I've lived a life of debauchery, and it's all on me. I refused to exercise self-control. We talked about that in class this morning, didn't we? But he was broken, but he was stubborn. He was broken. He lost all his money. Then you would think, well, I got to go back. But he was like some people, had to be broken again and again. Finally, when this man does come to his senses, he says, here's what I've got to do. Here's what I've got to do. I've got to get up. And I've got to go back to my father. And here's the attitude I need to have. We just read a little while ago. Verse 18. I will get up and go to my father. And will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. That is humility. That is humbleness. That is an opening of the self up and saying, I have been so wrong. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I've defamed you. I've defaced you. I've treated you with the utmost of contempt. Please make me as one of your hired men. I threw the word please in there. I think it's implied. He said, this is what I've got to do. This is where I have to be. And I am now going to have to go back, an abject failure, stand before my father, stand before everyone who has been associated with me since youth, and go back as a broken, cast off of an individual. Well, that's where we were in sin. That we're that way. We have to get to that point where we reach the bottom of the barrel. And then we come to the point of, I've had enough of this. I've had enough. Kathy Thompson took on a noble cause years ago. She asked me to be part of it by serving as chairman of the board of the Alice House. And Kathy would invite women in who were homeless, had any number of issues. And Kathy sat down and I told her, you need to set up house rules. And she did. Friday mornings, I would go over with several of the other ladies for a while. We'd have Bible classes with those women. And they would talk about the challenges that they faced. And then I backed out and let the women then take over. And Joy and Linda Miller and Karen Miller. I think Janice was still working at the time, my wife Linda. And others would go over and have class with them. A couple of them recognized where they had gone. A couple of them obeyed the gospel of Christ, moved on with their lives. I don't know what happened to them. But the stories that they would tell broke your heart. And I was so proud of Kathy that she was able to help some come to a better realization of what they needed to do. This young man came to that realization on his own. Decided, I've got to go back and I've got to be honest. And I've got to tell my father exactly what it is. I've got to make peace with my father. And I've got to realize that I'm not going to be welcomed back as a son, but I'm all right with that. Because I know my father is of such a kind that he will treat me well, even after all that I've done to him. So now let's focus in on the Father. Go back into Luke 15. And he got up, verse 20. He came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. I've been very honest, I think, with regards to the lives of our sons. And each one of them has come home at least once. And I remember in anticipation of the arrival of each one, I waited anxiously for them. One asked to be picked up somewhere. was out in the middle of nowhere, out north and east of Fresno. And he said, I'll be there by the Burger King waiting for you. So we pull up. And my heart's jumping out of my chest. Linda goes into the Burger King to use the restroom. I'm sitting out there waiting for my son. He's sitting behind me, but I don't recognize him. Finally, I hear his voice, and I call his name. And I fight back tears. That father, I can only put myself in his position. What he must have been feeling as he sees his son. And he wants only the best for his son. The son's made the trek, and he runs out to meet him. Notice the father didn't go in search of the son. The son came back in search of the father. And the father, by this, was anxious. And he was looking. And he saw his son coming from afar. And the son said to him in verse 21, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Exactly what he had determined to say before any words were exchanged. He tells his father, here's what it is. I am so sorry. I apologize. And I'm not worthy to be called your son. See, God does not want any to perish, but he wants all to come to repentance, is what Peter writes in 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. And how precious that is. God stands there like this father. And on my mind's eye, I can visualize it. Like this father standing on a hill. And he sees his son coming from afar. And he decides, this is my son. He runs to greet him. You can imagine the emotion. God does not want any one of his children to perish. Now remember that at one time, this son was in the household of the father. Then by his own choice, he decides to leave. The father is waiting for him to come back. So I look at this a couple different ways. I look at this as, truly applicable to those that have never put on Christ. Truly. But then I look at it from the standpoint of those that have put on Christ and that have wandered away from the Father. Said, I really don't care about you anymore. The Father says, I don't want you to perish. I'm here waiting for your return. Are you willing to come back? Are you willing to come back on my terms? And that is that you have to recognize what you've done. And I'm willing to accept you back. Because that's what the son knew. Before he even went back, he said, here's what I've got to do. Before I even go back, I've got to be of the mind to do this. And so he tells this to the father. Verse 22. But the father doesn't say anything to the son. Notice that. We don't have anything being recorded right now in this parable. The father said to his slaves, quickly bring out the best robe. Put it on him. Put a ring on his hand. Sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf. Kill it. And let us eat and be merry. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to be merry. Now notice this. The father welcomed back his son's return. Every time one of our sons came back, I welcomed him back. And I don't know if Linda knows that every time they came back, I wept. And I also kind of sat them down and told them how the kitty was going to walk the tightrope. and what we really wanted for each one of them. Did it always succeed? No. No, it hasn't. I was hoping that something that happened to Adam last week would change him. I think it has, but I don't think he's known how to respond. And I'll share with you what changed. Last Monday, Adam went to a wake for a friend of his that worked with him at the studio. He was more than a friend. He was his boss when Adam first went to work at Disney Studios. After COVID, that individual said, I've got family issues to deal with. I'm going to resign my position, and I'm going to suggest you become the master electrician and the supervisor for all electricians at Disney, at ABC, at Marvel, and the other place they bought down on Pico in Century City. And Adam took that on because of that friend. The friend came back. Ultimately, the friend worked for Adam because he was having to travel and couldn't work the number of hours. But he got COVID. He was in the hospital with COVID for 3 months on a ventilator. He lost his battle to COVID 10 days, 2 weeks ago. But at the wake, he gave his wife a note for Adam, which she read. And in the note, and this man, his name was Clint, to the best of my knowledge, was not anything religious. But he knew that at one time Adam had been, and that his father and mother were faithful Christians. And in the letter, he begged Adam, my word, not necessarily Adam's, to go back to church, to do what was right. Adam told us about this a week ago Monday. It's been a hard week for him. I hope it's hard still. I hope it's unbearably hard for him, because I want him to realize that his Heavenly Father wants him to come back, wants him to return to a relationship. But I pray that daily, not only for Adam, but for our son Micah, for our son Jacob. I pray it on behalf of Dan and Tracy's children, on behalf of Al and Janice's children, for that matter, on behalf of each and every child that has left the household of faith. To me, this is emotional. And it should be for every person. It should be emotional. God cares for us. He loves us. And this is what's being seen in this father. I mean, he manifested his joy openly. This son of mine was dead. He's come to life again. He's come back to life. Put that in context with what Al just talked about surrounding the table. How Jesus, the Son of God, was dead, came back to life, in order that he would blaze the trail that we could come back to life in relationship with our Heavenly Father. And he's welcome back. Not as a hired hand, which he was willing to do, but he was welcomed back as a member of the family. Here's how we know that. The robe was put on him. The family ring was given to him, placed on his finger. You're back, son, as a precious member of the family. Shoes put on his feet. Only slaves went barefooted. So you got so many different things being seen that really emphasize the point. The Father is our source of salvation. He is the consummate of everything that we hope for, everything that we long for. Well, we're going to see the other side of the family dynamic here as we gather together at 2:30, when we're going to talk about the older son. But as we bring this lesson to a conclusion, as every time we gather together, we do like to extend a gospel invitation. That if you're afield from God, far apart from the Father, you don't have to remain there. that there is a way to come back, a way to be brought back into the family. All it takes is a willingness on your part